Understanding the postcolonial trajectories of peace and conflict in Asia is particularly complex, as it encompasses a plurality of historical colonial projects. On the one hand, different parts of Asia were colonized by several European powers, partly through their corporations such as the East India Companies. On the other hand, imperial and colonial actors within Asia, such as Japan and the Soviet Union, are central in the histories of peace and conflict, decolonization processes, and memory. Against this background, considering the Asian experience complicates key concepts, such as the global North and the global South, bringing in the global East. Asia also points to the entanglements of imperialism and colonialism and brings into question binary approaches such as colonizers and colonized. Furthermore, Asia does not only span over half of the globe, but is also home to more than half of the global population. Hence, it is impossible to offer a unifying reading of the past and present dynamics of peace and conflict in the continent. In light of this complexity, in this video we try to avoid both excessive abstraction and excessive particularism. Instead, four scholars will provide diverse theoretical insights from which we can approach peace and conflict in Asia today. What all of them share is an analysis of how histories of colonialism and imperialism shape both the present of nation-states and the individual experiences. We begin with a reflection by Selbi Durdiyeva, a social legal researcher focusing on access to justice, transitional justice, and decolonization, on how the unprocessed legacies of the Russian Empire and the Soviet Union continue to shape national identity, collective memory, and aggression in the present-day Russian Federation.
Postcolonial melancholia is a concept coined by British sociologist Paul Gilroy to describe the state of British society after most of its colonies gained independence. Melancholia is the process described by Freud that is happening when a person or a society suffers loss but cannot truly process it. Instead of mourning and letting go, the lost object is internalized and painfully pursued. In a colonial context, the lost object is the empire itself. Postcolonial melancholia is not nostalgia in the ordinary sense, it's a refusal to mourn the loss of empire. The colonizer cannot separate itself from the former colonies and instead develops an obsessive attachment to the fantasy of imperial glory. This leads to distorted politics of memory, denial of past atrocities, scapegoating of victims, and longing for renewed greatness, often resulting in what Freud coined as destructive drives. Now, how does it apply to Russia? Russia, and before the Soviet Union, never acknowledged the violent legacies of its imperial past and continuation in present. From the conquest of indigenous peoples, to famines like Holodomor and Asharshalik, to the Gulag system, these atrocities were never repaired, never mourned, and never accounted for. Instead, state memory politics glorify victory, especially World War II, turning suffering in what Volkan and Javakashvili call a chosen glory, rather than a call for accountability. This refusal to mourn fuels a melancholic attachment to empire. Russia becomes what it lost, a self-styled empire that feels entitled to dominate its neighbors. Ukraine in particular is imagined as the central lost object, the symbolic heart of imperial identity. The full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022 then is not an isolated event. It's a continuation of the unresolved colonial condition, a violent attempt to reincorporate what was lost to preserve the fantasy of greatness. So why is postcolonial melancholia a proper lens to study Russia today? Because it explains not only Russia's full-scale invasion and war in Ukraine, but also deeper cultural logic behind it. It shows how propaganda finds fertile grounds in society, predisposed to destructive drives by unprocessed pasts. In my recent article, I emphasized the need to use Fanon's concept sociogeny rather than traditional psychoanalytic diagnosis that focuses on individual psyche rather than a society as a whole. Fanon famously argued that individual psychic condition is predetermined by social, cultural, political climate in the country, and colonial situation creates certain mental conditions like postcolonial melancholia. It reveals how denial and glorification of empire creates cycles of violence. And it reminds us that justice cannot come without mourning, without Russia acknowledging its colonial history and present, its victims and its responsibility. In short, post-colonial melancholia helps us see Russia's actions not as a sudden madness, but as an outcome of long-standing attachment to empire. And it points towards the only way forward: decolonizing memory, replacing melancholia with mourning, and making space for accountability and repair.
Following the legacies of imperial expansion and colonial domination, East Asia remains deeply shaped by unresolved memories of occupation, war, and resistance. Jie-Hyun, a scholar on nationalism, memory and post-colonial studies from South Korea, reflects on how historical injustices and collective memories inform the search for peace in East Asia. Instead of a simple narrative on reconciliation, nations across East Asia, such as Japan and China, construct competing memories of victimhood.
As anywhere else in the world, I think this post-colonial memories in East Asia is a very dense minefield. One cannot really escape from that dense minefield without, treading on the ends of mines and being wounded. Because without really doing post-colonial memories in East Asia, we cannot really go forward to a sort of, certain a peaceful East Asia or regional peace. Victimhood nationalism, my concept, is one of the key concepts through which we can explore and understand a new stage of conflicts that globalization has brought to us. Nowadays, the focus of the nationalist discourses began to shift from heroes to victims. In the traditionally, nationalism has been leaning very heavily towards the heroes, national heroes. But with the globalization of memories and globalization of our imagination or globalization of entangled histories, people began to recognize that our national heroes can be bastards beyond our national frontiers. So people began to recognize that emphasis of victims or victimhood or the experience of being victimized is more efficient way of appealing to the global public space or global civil society. So suddenly we can see that with the globalization, the national discourse has shifted from the heroes to the victims. So victim nationalism is a certain, in a sense, a certain metamorphosis of nationalisms which want to survive the globalization by changing its own contents and forms. Victim nationalism, in a sense, is a narrative or a narrative template which tries to justify present nation by inheriting these victims' experiences, and as a way of justifying their national cause, it is different from the perpetrators' nations. So in East Asian case, have a look at Japan. For instance, Japan always has focused on the Avon victims, and they were victimized in the POW camp in Siberia. They were victimized also in the process of repatriation of Japanese civilians in Manchuria and the Korean Peninsula. It's like very, very similar to German victimhood, which emphasized POW camps in Soviet Union, Vertriebene, right? Allied bombing. So it's surprisingly they have a similar experiences. On the other hand, the the victimized nation or colonized nations like Korea and China, they always emphasize that they were victimized Japanese colonialism or Western colonialism. So in the way, they try to justify the present-day nationalist discourses and nationalist cause. So in that sense, victim nationalism really a threatening force or barrier to the historical reconciliation in East Asia and other area of the world. And so how to victimize victim nationalism might be one of the very important tasks to imagine the regional force in East Asia.
Victimhood nationalism allows us to understand how the past is evoked for current political national projects. Similarly, as international relations scholar Siddharth Tripathi elaborates, India evokes its colonial past to claim the leading role for the so-called Global South and to promote its own project of world order. Claiming the role of leadership under a unified umbrella obscures the differences within the Global South and reshapes power hierarchies today.
The term Global South is everywhere, from UN speeches to G20 summits, academic articles, and journalistic narratives. It is not just an analytical category or a demographic label. Increasingly, it is becoming a political identity, a way for states to challenge old colonial hierarchies and imaginary new forms of world ordering. Few countries have embraced this narrative more energetically than India. Traditionally, the Global South refers broadly to developing nations, formerly referred to as the Third World. Today, it functions as a post-colonial political project, a banner under which states articulate shared historical grievances, demand for fairer international institutions, and also questions the Western dominance in global governance. India positions itself as one of the leading voices of the Global South. Through its G20 presidency, climate diplomacy, and South-South cooperation, India presents itself as a bridge between the rising multipolar world and the concerns of historically marginalized nations on account of colonialism. India has been invoking its experience of colonial rule to argue that it understands injustices faced by other Global South states. At the same time, it projects itself as a civilizational state with a unique moral and cultural authority to intervene into global debates. In this way, post-colonial history becomes a form of diplomatic capital and means of legitimizing India's leadership role also as a leader of the Global South. Having said that, it would be wrong to assume Global South as a unified category. And if we homogenize the whole Global South, we are hiding important complexities. The Global South contains diverse political systems, economic structures, and geopolitical priorities. Some states are rising powers, others remain deeply constrained by global economic inequalities. If one particular country takes the lead, there is a danger of oversimplification and obscuring the differences. At one level, Global South is presented as a community of solidarity, but at the other level, it can also become a platform for competition among states who are seeking an important role in international politics. The rise of Global South narrative marks an important shift in world politics. Despite the critiques of the concept, rooted in post-colonial aspirations for fairness, the Global South states are challenging the dominant narratives and also dominance of Western liberal international order and institutions. This represents an attempt to create a new international order, but also new kind of world ordering, one that reflects the priorities of non-Western states and societies. This ordering doesn't necessarily eliminate hierarchies, rather reshapes it or reconfigures it, redistributing authority and influence among a broader set of actors amidst post-colonial complexities. So the politicization of Global South as a concept is both empowering and paradoxical. It confronts historical injustices, yet it can reproduce certain other forms of inequalities. It challenges old forms of dominance while simultaneously constructing new ones. Countries like India, who are at the center of this transformation, they use post-colonial identity narratives and strategic ambition to redefine what global order could look like in the decades ahead.
Even though the experiences of Asian countries with colonialism and imperialism differ, they share recent experiences of war and the struggles for enduring peace. Teresa Jopson, a scholar in conflict, human rights, and gender, critically reflects on the notion of post-conflict. By questioning what peace really means, who defines it, and whose voices are included in shaping it.
The term post-conflict refers to the end of civil wars and the conclusion of internationally recognized peace negotiations in conflict, peace, and development discourses that are mainstream. This use problematically hides sources of conflict and violence that are especially embedded in neoliberal peace agendas, and especially embedded and promoted in the international structures in the 1990s onwards. So this brand of elite-driven peace building has actually created tensions on the ground because they did not usually incorporate voices and diverse perspectives from the people that are actually involved. So the label post-conflict actually becomes a misnomer in light of conflict relapse. And this is prevalent in the global south, especially because the sources of conflict were left unaddressed. As examples in Southeast Asia have shown, those that development and funding agencies label as post-conflict are societies still dealing with the various forms of violence and insecurities. In the most basic philosophical and empirical senses, we have yet to find a true post-conflict society. Similar to the use of post-colonial as a temporal marker, and in contrast to its use as a qualitative description of post-coloniality, I think it would be useful to develop post-conflict as a concept that accounts for the lasting impacts of war and other conflicts. So how can we reimagine post-conflict through decolonial lenses and contribute to visualizing or visibilizing conflicts that underpin spectacular wars and envisioning peace building that actually addresses epistemic and discursive violences? I think that recognizing plurality, or the plural ways of knowing and being that connect people to one another and to the worlds around them, requires post-conflict to promote ways that do not actively endanger other beings. And this exercise in understanding the entanglements of contemporary conflicts with historical hierarchies is a more accurate use of the term. It advances multiple levels of social justice that reduces sources of conflict and violence, and thus creates a more durable and sustainable peace. So post-conflict in this sense is a sublime goal and a process that entails eliminating the multi-dimensions of poverty and building social and political consensuses that promote the best possible quality of lives on Earth.